In Silver Creek, a town built on cotton and buried grief, the hospital stood like something newer than it was. Its white facade caught the morning sun in a way that made people forget the shingles were rusted underneath. The ward smelled faintly of lemon and old linens. A painted sign near the back read, "Mortuary Entry, Authorized Staff Only," and beneath it a small brass bell hung crooked above the service hatch. Most days it stayed quiet, touched only by wind or shift workers with paperwork to deliver. But on certain nights, always between the hours of 2 and 4, the bell would ring with no one there. Nurse Eliza Poe was the first to start recording it, not because she thought it was important, but because it was persistent. At first it had seemed random, once at 2:11 a.m., then again a week later at 3:37. But then it came 3 nights in a row, then 5. Always when she was alone during the changeover, walking the back corridor where the tiles felt a little colder, where the light above the stairwell hummed louder than it should. She had a habit of keeping lists, small comforts in a place where things disappeared too quietly. Bedpans, blankets, sometimes names. She began writing down each ring in the back of her nurse's log, circling the time and underlining it if the bell rang twice. Over the next month, she filled 2 pages. When she mentioned it during a smoke break, another nurse laughed and said, "Maybe it's the bodies ringing for a second chance." But she noticed no one ever stood near the bell unless they had to. The hospital was proud of its efficiency. Patients were declared, tagged, and wheeled down before dawn. A clean death, they called it. The mortuary staff rarely spoke to the nurses unless there was a form missing or a wristband too loose. And yet, even with all the order, there was something off about that hallway after dark. The lights always flickered near the 3rd door on the left, the one that led down to the prep room. And sometimes when Eliza walked past it just before the bell rang, she'd feel the air shift. Not cold exactly, just still, like breath held too long, the kind of still that feels like waiting. She told herself it was nothing. That grief and long hours made the brain turn ordinary things into strange ones. But one morning, after a particularly loud ring, she opened the hatch. No one stood there. The loading area was empty. No stretchers, no carts. But the hatch handle was warm. Warmer than it should have been in January. She didn't tell anyone about that part. Instead, she copied her log entries into a smaller book, the kind with a red cover and gold trim. She began to draw the bell symbol beside each time it rang. When the symbol repeated 3 nights in a row at exactly 3:16 a.m., she drew a line connecting them. Then another when it happened again the following week. Patterns. She had always trusted patterns. She didn't yet know that someone else was tracking them too. That deep in the archives below the furnace there was a second log, not kept by a nurse, but by someone who no longer needed sleep. That log didn't use times. It used symbols. 11 of them, each drawn with a perfect loop at the top like a noose or a musical note. Some were smudged, some were marked with wax. All had been written before Eliza ever touched her pen. The bell rang again the following Tuesday. She logged it. But this time, after writing the time, 3:16 a.m., she paused. For the first time in weeks, she didn't hear the echo fade. Because it didn't. The bell kept ringing. 4 times. 5. Then silence. And beneath that silence, something new began. Something she didn't yet have words for. But it had already started. Before the list. Before the log. Before the bell was even installed. Because some patterns don't start. They wait. And now, one had woken up. Horace Bell had worked the Silver Creek mortuary floor for 13 years. He knew the quiet that came with the dead, the way the skin cooled in patterns, the way a body settled heavier by the hour. He preferred working alone. He liked the silence, the control. The way things followed his rhythm down there, not like the chaos upstairs. On a gray morning after the first snow, he received the body of Etta Marsh, age 46, recorded as expired from cardiac arrest just after midnight. She'd been brought down early, her name still fresh on the intake sheet. The tag looped around her toe bore the right date, the right spelling, the right signature from Dr. Lark. Everything was in order. She didn't look peaceful, but most didn't. There was a tightness in the brow as though something had tried to leave just before the heart gave out and got stuck behind the eyes. He always noted that, quietly, internally. He prepared the tools, scissors, clamp, trocar, routine. The scent of ethanol and lemon hung in the air like usual, masking the stronger things. He cut her gown carefully and began to wash the skin. She had a scar near the left collarbone, old, surgical. He made a mental note but didn't write it down. When the phone rang in the hall, he left her for less than a minute, just enough time to step into the corridor and answer the call. A nurse asking about paperwork misfiled upstairs. When he returned, the table was no longer still. Etta Marsh was sitting up, eyes open, back arched slightly, head tilted like she was trying to listen to something very far away. Her lips parted, dry, trembling. Then one word came out. Wrong. That was all. The moment held for only seconds before she collapsed sideways, shoulder cracking against the metal tray, eyes still open but vacant now. Truly vacant. Horace didn't shout, he didn't panic. He reached for a blanket, covered her gently, then locked the prep room and turned off the light. What followed was not an investigation, it was a meeting. Administrators from 2 floors up, clipboard men who never touched a body, arrived without announcing themselves. Sister Mercy Hale sat beside them, humming something low and tuneless. Horace explained what he'd seen. He didn't embellish. He didn't omit. He even repeated the word. Wrong, he said. She said it once, then fell. They nodded. One asked if he'd had much sleep. Another gently reminded him of something called post-mortem neuromuscular release, a phrase long enough to feel comforting. The meeting ended with a form. The mercy note was a pale green page with blank space at the top, a series of pre-printed affirmations in the center and a place for signature below. The wording said the incident was understood to be within expected biological variance and posed no ethical, procedural, or medical conflict. Signing it meant accepting that what occurred had already passed, that the dead could do strange things sometimes, that the body doesn't know it's dead right away. Horace signed it. They always did. Etta Marsh was listed as cremated within 12 hours. No family claimed her. Her remains were stored in a cardboard urn with no label in the shelf marked uncollected. Horace resumed work the next day. He sterilized the table again, even though it didn't need it. But that night he noticed something strange. On the ceiling directly above the prep station, condensation had formed, a thin line curved like a smile. The room hadn't been humid, it hadn't been warm. And then the bell rang. Once, softly. It wasn't the doorbell, it was smaller, closer. The kind of bell tied to something delicate, like a wrist. But he was alone, or so he told himself. The next case came in before dawn. A boy, age 17, cardiac arrhythmia. Dr. Lark had already signed off. Sister Mercy had already arranged the linens. The process moved forward. Horace adjusted the lights and turned the faucet on. But when he reached for the scissors, he paused. The metal tray was wet, and beside the handle, written in the mist, was a single word, wrong. He wiped it away and didn't tell anyone. But the pattern had started, not just the ringing, the waking. Sister Mercy Hale moved like someone who never needed to rush. Her shoes never clicked on the tile, her eyes never startled. She wore her hair in a tight gray bun, untouched by age, and always carried a satchel that seemed too soft to hold anything sharp. She wasn't a nun in any formal way. The title came from habit and tone, but no one questioned it. She ran the hospital's bereavement services with such quiet grace that grieving families often thanked her for the way she made death feel less heavy. It was said that her tea, always steeped with rosemary, helped calm even the most broken. That her voice, low and hymn-like, could lull a sobbing mother into sleep. In the front rooms, that was her gift, comfort. In the back corridors, it was something else entirely. Sister Mercy was the only one with a key to the drawer beneath the viewing table. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and tied with ribbon, were linen strips bearing the Silver Creek crest. She called them tokens of stillness. Officially, they were meant to support the jaw or bind the hands, but hers were different. The fabric was thinner, the edges heat-sealed. Some bore faint discoloration, pale pinks, yellows, even green, though no one ever asked why. When staff asked how she got them so clean, she would smile and say, "Peace leaves no stain." She used the linens when setting the face, a term that sounded simple but was anything but. Sister Mercy believed in the sacred look of rest. The mouth closed, not clenched, the eyes softened, not sealed. She had her own way of arranging features that seemed to erase pain completely, even in the most violent deaths. After her touch, the body looked grateful, as though it had been released from something unspoken. But she always worked fast, too fast. It became something staff whispered about, how a patient declared only minutes ago could appear in the viewing room already prepped, hands folded, eyes peaceful, no bruising, no residue, just clean skin and a faint scent of lavender. Some called it skill, others called it unnatural. One intern, after watching her set a child's mouth with 2 fingers and a humming breath, left the room shaking. He told the charge nurse later. She didn't even touch the boy's jaw. She just looked at him, and it settled. He was moved to another floor the next day. Sister Mercy kept a record book, but no one was permitted to see it, not even the administrator. She said it was for prayers, though the pages were thick and the book was marked with a brass lock shaped like an eye. When asked about it once during inspection, she placed her hand on the cover and whispered, "They only wake if forgotten." The inspector didn't ask twice. Families trusted her. They always did. Because she said the right things. She cried gently at the right moments. She asked if the mother wanted to hold her daughter one last time, if the husband wanted her to sing the hymn they'd played at their wedding. And they said yes. They always said yes, because when you're grieving, you don't question the person who offers calm. You drink the tea, you nod, you sign the release forms. You thank her for making it all easier. But in the basement, after the families had gone, the linens were burned in a furnace that no one else used. She never washed them. She never reused them. She folded them once, placed them in a copper tray, and fed them to flame. The smell was never of cloth. It was something sweeter, almost like sugar, almost like skin. One night, the mortuary apprentice came in early and caught sight of her standing over the newest intake, a man in his 50s, still warm. She hadn't seen him watching. Her fingers hovered above the man's brow, not touching, just tracing. And then she sang a low note, not a hymn, not even a melody. Just a long, steady tone. The man's eyelids fluttered, then closed, fully, quietly. She turned and smiled at the boy. "It's better," she said. "When they close on their own." He never came back to that floor again. But she stayed, always gentle, always ready, always humming. And that week the bell rang every night, at the same time, 3:16. Exactly. Dr. Walter Lark had the kind of presence that made people speak softer around him. He was never loud, never impatient, and always arrived before sunrise, carrying a sack of day-old bread crusts for the stray cats that lingered near the boiler vent. He wore a brown wool coat even in summer and smelled faintly of cedar and paper. Staff loved him. Families trusted him. He wrote condolence letters by hand and tucked small pressed flowers inside each envelope. Daisies, baby's breath, bluebells. No one remembered him raising his voice. No one ever saw him rush. If you asked about him, people smiled and said, "He brings dignity to the end." But few ever followed him into the basement, and even fewer asked about the room at the end of the south corridor, the one with the heavy door and the plaque that simply read, "Quiet Room." It wasn't on most hospital maps. The room had no medical equipment, no gurney, no overhead lights, just a narrow cot, a side table, and a wooden chair beside a ledger stand. The walls were bare, the floor waxed to a dull sheen. A small window sat high above the cot, too thick to open. The only decoration was a shelf with a metronome that ticked without a pendulum. This was where Dr. Lark made his pronouncements, not on the ward, not at the bedside, here, alone, in stillness. He called it allowing the body time to decide. The standard procedure for declaring death at Silver Creek was a 5-minute auscultation with a stethoscope, confirmation by chart, and then a formal pronouncement logged in duplicate. But Dr. Lark believed in a pause, a final offering of silence. He would sit beside the body for exactly 12 minutes, the length of a slow rosary said without moving the lips. Then, and only then, he would press 2 fingers to the neck, touch the sternum, and write a name in the ledger with a black ink pen that he sharpened himself. No one challenged this method. It wasn't illegal. It was traditional. And he made results look peaceful. But strange things clung to that room. Every nurse who entered described the same sensation, a sharp cold that wasn't temperature but pressure, like the room was holding something in. The bulb in the wall sconce flickered but never burned out. The ledger pages turned when no one touched them. And when the door was closed, the ticking of the metronome could be heard all the way back up the hall, even through 2 layers of stone. Once during maintenance, a janitor found a feather tucked into the drawer of the side table. Not a bird's feather, something shaped like a plume but too thin, too pale, and warm to the touch. He left it there and didn't report it. The same man quit 2 weeks later after mopping the hallway and hearing what he swore was someone breathing behind the quiet room door. But the room was empty. The light was off. The door was locked. Dr. Lark logged each body with a symbol beside the name. Not letters, not numbers, just a series of marks, dots, curls, sometimes a diagonal slash with a loop at the end. When asked once during audit what they meant, he said, "It's for continuity." No one questioned it again. The room was cold, not just in feeling but in fact. Thermometer readings taken during inspection always returned 2 degrees lower than anywhere else in the hospital, even when the furnace ran full, even when the hallway outside was warm. He said it helped slow the departure. Those who observed him noticed his habit of speaking to the deceased, not with grief, not even with reverence, but with familiarity, as if checking in, as if confirming something agreed upon. He would murmur soft phrases, never fully audible, while resting his hand on the chest of the recently stilled. Then he would nod, as if receiving an answer. When questioned about his practice, Dr. Lark smiled in the way people do when someone asks about a deeply personal belief. He said only, "Stillness is not silence. The body speaks if we listen." That winter, the quiet room ledger added 11 new names, each with a looped symbol, each followed by a mercy note. The room remained cold. The metronome ticked, and upstairs, Eliza Poe logged her 12th bell. Same hour, same minute. But this time, the tone was lower, as if struck by a heavier hand. Nora Pike had only worked at Silver Creek Hospital for 3 months when she noticed the ledger. She was a junior clerk, barely 20, hired through a cousin's recommendation and trusted with nothing more complicated than filing end-of-shift forms and recording linen usage. Her desk sat between records and storage, a forgotten hallway where dust gathered in the corners and the lights flickered no matter how often the bulbs were replaced. Most days passed without incident. Charts came in, charts went out, and she penciled numbers into boxes without thinking. But on a slow Tuesday, while reorganizing archived entries from the mortuary floor, she found a leather-bound volume that didn't match the rest. It was older than it should have been. Its spine was cracked. The cover soft from years of handling, and it had no title, just a single gold-embossed symbol on the front. A circle interrupted by a vertical line, like a keyhole or a coin split in half. Inside, the pages were neat but strange. Each line began with a date, followed by a time and then a mark. Not a name, not an ID number, just a small symbol. Some resembled musical notes, others looked like tiny knots or hooks, a few like stylized birds or insects. There were no columns for diagnosis, no mention of attending physicians, no indication of who these entries belonged to at all. At first, Nora thought it was a mistake. A practice book, maybe, or a private journal. But the dates were recent. Too recent. One of them, March 3rd, 3:16 a.m., matched the exact time she'd seen written in red pen on a patient form marked, "Do not file." Her curiosity sharpened. She flipped ahead. March 5th, 3:16 a.m., March 7th, again. Same hour, same minute, different symbol. A hooked figure, then a double slash, then something that looked like a swan with its neck bent backwards. She didn't know why it unnerved her until later when Nurse Poe passed through her hallway and dropped off a stack of linen requests. The older woman looked tired, her voice distant. As she turned to leave, Nora caught a glimpse of her notebook, a small red one with a frayed corner, and saw the words, "Bell, 3:16 a.m." underlined twice in pencil. She waited until the hallway was empty before flipping back through the ledger. Every third night, always at 3:16 and always followed by a new mark. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she began copying the entries by hand, one at a time, slipping each page into the hollowed-out center of her lunch pail. She lined the inside with wax paper to keep them dry, sealing the lid with a scrap of tape she changed every few days so no one would notice. She wasn't sure what she was gathering. Evidence? Secrets? She only knew it felt wrong that no one had names, that these people, if they were people were being reduced to symbols in a book no one admitted existed. Once she tried to ask the head of records, Mr. Birch, about a missing patient file from March 7th. He smiled and said, "That one wasn't ours, just inventory." She pressed, asking what that meant. He said, still smiling, "Sometimes you write things down so they don't get up again." After that, she kept quiet, but her hands shook every time she touched the ledger. She began to notice things. A fine layer of ash on the windowsill near her desk. A rust-colored thumbprint on the margin of one page that hadn't been there before. The smell of something metallic like iron left in water coming from the vent above the filing cabinet. Then one night, while copying a new page, she noticed the symbol looked familiar. A looped figure, half-moon shape. She flipped back through her copied pages. The same mark had appeared before, one but never twice for the same date or time. She looked closer. One was March 3rd, the other, dated 2 years earlier. Same time, same loop, different hand. She realized then that the ledger wasn't new. It had been added to for years, quietly, secretly. And whoever kept it wasn't logging the dead. They were logging something else, something older than procedure. something that returned. The bell rang that night again, exactly 3:16 a.m. She was still at her desk. She didn't flinch this time. But she didn't look up either because she finally understood. The ledger wasn't a record, it was a lock. Jonas Reed started his apprenticeship in the mortuary suite of Silver Creek Hospital on a Monday morning that smelled like old soap and something faintly burnt. He'd expected more noise, more bustle, maybe a welcome tour or someone to explain the schedule. Instead, he was handed a pair of thin gloves and told to stand still. The man who greeted him, someone in a dark apron who never gave his name, simply said, "No talking in Prep Room C unless you're ready to carry a name." Jonas didn't know what that meant, so he said nothing. Prep Room C was cooler than the others. It held no windows, no cabinets for medication, no tables for autopsy. But what it did have was something Jonas had never seen before. A wall rack mounted above the washing basin lined with narrow glass flasks, each about the size of a child's forearm. The flasks were clear, sealed with wax, and hung from iron hooks that creaked when the furnace below kicked on. Etched into each flask was a single letter, sometimes neat, sometimes jagged, followed by a number written in black grease pencil. At first, Jonas thought they were just decorative. Then he noticed how carefully they were spaced, how no two touched. The man in the apron finally said, "Those are the farewells. You don't breathe near them." Later, Sister Mercy told Jonas the flasks were part of an old custom, a spiritual service, she called it, for families who believed in soul partings. She explained that just after the last breath leaves the body, a trace of it remains in the room, a residue of life not yet gone. The farewell flasks were designed to capture that. She said families used to carry them home, keep them on shelves, open them during grief anniversaries to feel close to the dead again. But over time, people stopped asking for them. Most forgot they existed. Now the flasks stayed in the hospital. Jonas wanted to believe that, but the flasks weren't dusty. The wax was fresh, and new bottles appeared every few days. He noticed the grease pencil marks never repeated. The numbers were always different, but always followed by a sound notation. Chime 1, chime 2, chime 5. He asked once what the chime was. The apron man said, "You'll hear it when the furnace breathes right." It happened 2 weeks in. Jonas was alone, wiping down the prep table when the heating vents groaned and the furnace kicked on harder than usual. The room shifted temperature, not warm, not cold, but thin, like the air had been scraped of something. And then the sound began, faint at first, a ringing, high-pitched, delicate. Not from a bell, from glass, one note, then another, then a strange, cascading sequence like fingers running across a line of crystal glasses filled with uneven water. It wasn't musical, it wasn't dissonant either, it was precise. He looked up at the rack. The bottles were vibrating, not all, just a few. The ones labeled CHL. Their sound lasted no more than 30 seconds, then silence. The wax seals dripped once, then hardened. No one explained it afterward. But he noticed the bottles that sang were replaced the next day. Carefully removed, wiped, placed in a box, and carried down the hall to the locked room beside the furnace chute. Jonas began keeping his own list. Just initials. Just chime numbers. The third time it happened, he recognized one of the letters. E. He had helped clean a woman named Etta Marsh. Her bottle rang at chime 3. The same day, he found a scrap of linen in the waste bin near the flasks. It was burned at one end and smelled faintly of sugar and rot. Etched faintly in the weave was a number, 11. He didn't tell anyone. He just started holding his breath whenever the bottles began to sing. Something inside him said they weren't music. They were messages. Because the farewell flasks didn't echo breath, they echoed memory. They held on to what the body wasn't supposed to say, and in the wrong temperature, they let it out. That night the furnace roared twice, and the rack gave off no sound at all. Jonas had seen bodies set before, arms folded, jaws braced, eyes pressed closed with damp cotton. There was a method to it, learned in training manuals and refined with practice. But the way Sister Mercy did it was different. It didn't feel like technique, it felt like ritual. She didn't use the standard jaw blocks or chin straps. She never asked for help, and she never left marks. That's what made it so strange. Nothing she used was in the books, but everything she touched ended up perfect. The first time he watched her do it, he hadn't meant to. He was organizing scalpel casings in Prep Room B when he noticed the light in the adjoining embalming chamber flicker. She was standing over a girl, maybe 20, pale as paper, hands small and bloodless. Sister Mercy had her satchel open on the steel tray, and from it she withdrew a thin glass vial, twisted shut with a cork and sealed with wax. Inside, coiled like thread pulled from a spider's belly, was something almost invisible. Too fine to be string, too soft to be wire. She twisted the end free with gloved fingers and held it between her knuckles, humming something beneath her breath. Then with 2 long motions she guided the thread beneath the girl's jawline, drawing it up through the cheeks and into the scalp. There was no needle, no puncture, just pressure. Jonas could see the girl's mouth close, gently, as if she'd simply made a decision. The lips softened, the tension in her brow faded. He stepped closer to see better. That's when he noticed the girl's right eye. It fluttered, not in a twitch or spasm, but something slower, intentional, as if trying to blink. He held his breath, frozen. Sister Mercy didn't react. She just placed one finger on the girl's forehead and whispered, "There now. You're held." Later, when he asked what the thread was, she smiled and said it was a tool from the early days of the hospital. She called it the mercy stitch, a sacred tie to prevent last tremors, the little spasms that came when the soul wasn't quite ready to leave. She said most people never saw them because most people didn't know where to look. "It's not death we hold still," she said. "It's memory." Jonas didn't know what that meant. But he couldn't forget how the girl's face had changed, how the corners of her mouth had curved up almost imperceptibly, like the faint smile of someone remembering something from far away. It wasn't restful. It was eerie, too clean. He began to notice a pattern. Every body Sister Mercy touched bore that same look, lips gently sealed, brows relaxed, skin unmoving even during transfer. No shifting, no gasping, no noise. Other morticians used sutures and wiring and foam to keep the mouth from falling open during display. Sister Mercy used thread, one strand, no knots. And once she was done, the thread vanished. "Removed," she said before refrigeration, but Jonas never saw her take it out. One morning, while cleaning after hours, he found a small coil near the drain in the prep basin, translucent, fraying at the edge, warm despite the cold steel. He picked it up with forceps and held it to the light. The material shimmered like something organic. Not nylon, not silk, almost like tendon. His hands trembled and he dropped it into the sharps bin without logging it. But the smell lingered, faint and sweet like iron and honey. Later that week he noticed something else. The empty drawer beneath Sister Mercy's workstation, which once held her ledgers and cloth, now bore a series of faint scratches. At first glance, just wear and tear. But under closer inspection, he saw they formed a shape, not a word, a symbol. One he'd seen before, cut in the ledger Nora Pike had copied, in the looped marks beside the bottle rack. A perfect crescent, broken at the stem. He stopped going into the chamber alone after that, but it didn't matter, because each morning, the bodies still came. And each time he saw the same expression carved into the face: peaceful, placid, and wrong. And when he blinked too long, he thought he saw them blink back. The records didn't say resurrections, they didn't even say mistakes. What they said in small handwritten margins barely visible between lines of form print was brief recovery. Just 2 words, always in parentheses, followed by a reassurance that all post-mortem processes were paused, reassessed, and resumed in accordance with hospital policy. There were 11 such notations across 5 years, scattered across intake logs, linen requisitions, embalming receipts. Most staff didn't notice, most didn't want to, but those who did could feel the pattern pressing inward like a bruise forming beneath paperwork. The first was Mabel Durant, a schoolteacher brought in after collapsing on the courthouse steps. Declared dead at 12:09 a.m., wheeled to Prep Room A by 12:31, toe-tagged and gown cut by 12:42. But at 12:48, as Jonas gently washed her shoulder, her eyes opened. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She just gasped, a dry, sharp inhale that cracked her lips and clawed at the side of the enamel basin, tearing a fingernail clean off. Jonas backed away, called for help, but by the time Dr. Lark arrived, she had fallen still again. Lark checked her pulse. Nothing. Just the sound of the bottle rack above them faintly ringing chime 5. She was moved upstairs for observation. 3 days later, she was discharged. The note said shock episode, but the nurses who walked her out said she didn't blink the whole time, that she didn't even flinch when her own name was called. The second was David Klein, a coal miner found slumped against the wheel of his truck in the hospital parking lot. His heart had stopped hours earlier. Or so they thought. During setting of the hands, Sister Mercy paused. She said she felt something under his skin, a ripple, a pull. She unwrapped his wrist and Jonas saw it too, a single vein twitching in his forearm as if flexing against thread. Dr. Lark was summoned again. He watched for a moment, then gently placed a cloth over David's face and said, "It's just the nerve remembering." But later the entry was marked with a different phrase. Chime 2. Pause observed. Jonas kept track, quietly, on scraps, asterisks next to the names of the ones who came back, even if only for seconds. Not all screamed, some wept. One tried to speak but only managed to spit out water thick as syrup. Another sat bolt upright and simply said, "Why?" before convulsing and collapsing into the restraint strap. Each of the 11 had a bottle in the rack, each labeled with an initial and a chime number, and each one was burned, quickly, quietly. Sister Mercy oversaw every cremation herself. When Jonas asked why no autopsy was done on Mabel, she told him, "There's no need to question what is already left twice." But those who survived, the few who were recovered and not destroyed, came back wrong. Not visibly, not in ways that made noise, but in the quiet things. They stopped sleeping. They didn't eat unless prompted. They didn't blink unless watched. Mabel Durant withdrew from her teaching position and began spending 12 hours a day in a rocking chair beside her window, whispering to something no one else could see. David Klein was arrested 3 months later for standing outside the hospital's mortuary entrance for 6 nights straight, unmoving. When questioned, he said only, "They're singing wrong now." No public report was ever made. The hospital filed each case under neurological irregularity. But Jonas saw the trend, and Nora Pike, still copying symbols from the ledger, began circling dates that matched the recoveries. Each was preceded by a bell, each followed by a burn. The 11th was a boy, 15, drowned in the river, declared gone on arrival. But when the cooling blanket was applied, his eyes opened and locked onto Jonas's, not wildly, not desperately, but with full awareness. He whispered something Jonas couldn't hear, just lips moving around a shape. before going still again. The symbol for that night was the same as the first. A loop broken by a vertical line. They weren't random. They were marked. And something inside Jonas, something buried deep where fear stops pretending, began to wonder, if they weren't really dead, then who had called them back? The storm arrived with no warning. The sky turned the color of wet ash just after sunset, and within minutes rain began to hammer the windows like fists trying to be let in. The lights flickered once, then again, then vanished. Emergency lanterns clicked on in the upper wards, but downstairs in the mortuary wing the backup grid lagged. For 6 minutes the corridors held only shadow. And for 6 minutes the quiet room lost power. That night Nurse Eliza Poe had stayed late. Paperwork had stacked up, and she didn't trust the night shift to log the linen requisitions properly. Jonas Reed was still in Prep Room B cleaning out basin traps and trying not to think about the boy from the river. They didn't speak much anymore, not since the 11th recovery. But when the first light died, and the corridor sank into sudden blackness, both of them stepped into the hallway at the same time. Neither of them mentioned the quiet room, but their steps led there anyway. The door was closed as always, but something inside felt changed. The air had that wrong kind of cold, not clean, not sharp, but thick, like breath trapped in cotton. Eliza pressed her hand to the door and hesitated. Then the knock came. Once. Slow. Not at the door, but from inside the room. She turned the knob, Jonas behind her, heart racing but hands steady. Inside, the quiet room glowed faintly from the lantern mounted near the cot. A patient lay zipped inside a body shroud on the table. A middle-aged man, name already forgotten, declared just before the storm. The zipper was fully sealed. The tag read 3:16 a.m. And then the shroud moved. Not a twitch, a push. A palm pressing upward from the inside, slow and steady, then a muffled sound. Not speech, but breath, forced through clenched teeth. Jonas stepped forward, trembling, and began unzipping, inch by inch. When they reached the face, the man gasped, eyes wide, throat pulsing. His mouth opened, but no scream came out, just a hiss of recognition. He looked past them toward the far corner of the room where the rack of flasks still hung, barely visible in the stormlight. His gaze locked there, unmoving. He didn't thrash. He didn't cry. He just watched, lips trembling, as the glass bottles above began to shift. Not all, just one. The one labeled with the letter R and the number chime 6. The bottle trembled once, then stopped. The man blinked, closed his mouth, and went still. Not dead, not again, just empty. Dr. Lark arrived 10 minutes later, his coat soaked through from the storm. He checked the man's pulse, found it, then declared him in recovery. The body was moved to observation on the upper floor. No code was called, no notes were made, just a quick mark in the margin of the shift report, brief disruption, no further action. But Jonas returned later that night. He couldn't sleep, couldn't settle. He walked down the corridor with a flashlight and stood beneath the bottle rack, eyes scanning the flasks. R chime 6, gone. No broken glass, no wax remnants, no grease pencil mark. Just a hook, empty, slightly swinging. He checked the burn log. No cremation scheduled. No family claimed any farewell heir. The bottle had vanished, and above him in the silence the remaining bottles did not ring. They pulsed, softly, like lungs remembering how to breathe. The envelope arrived without a return address, sealed in twine, the paper brittle with age and stained by something the clerk couldn't name. It was left on the desk of Lillian Breck, senior inspector with the State Office of Institutional Oversight, who'd seen enough in her career to ignore most anonymous tips. But this one was different. Inside were dozens of torn ledger scraps, all bearing the same hospital crest. No names, no medical codes, just dates, times, and strange symbols, curling, looping, slashed figures like script from a forgotten language. At the bottom of the pile, a folded note on yellowed paper read only, "They do not all stay dead. Ask about the quiet room." Breck didn't hesitate. She'd investigated elder abuse cases, illegal internment wards, black market tissue sales. But something in her chest tightened when she read that phrase. They do not all stay dead. The handwriting was careful, shaken. She ordered an unannounced visit to Silver Creek Hospital. No prior warning, no courtesy calls. Just her badge, her ledger, and a court-issued writ permitting full access to all clinical spaces. She arrived on a Thursday just after dawn beneath skies the color of dry wool. The front desk clerk was startled but polite. The elevator made a sound like a swallowed breath as it descended. Staff avoided her eyes. The moment she introduced herself, the air in the administrative wing changed, not panicked, but cautious. Too cautious. Dean Harrow, the hospital's board chair, was summoned. He greeted her in a gray suit and yellow tie, sweating despite the cold. "We've nothing to hide," he said too quickly. "But a storm last week damaged our records room. A lot of older files are missing. Terrible timing." When she asked about the quiet room, he smiled, but his eyes tightened. "That space is part of our historical wing. A tradition. It's not used for anything official." She asked to see it. He hesitated, then offered instead a tour of the chapel. Downstairs, Dr. Walter Lark met her with a warm towel and a cup of chamomile tea. He had a way of speaking that smoothed things over, soft consonants, no pauses, always calm. He thanked her for visiting, said it was an honor. Invited her to walk the garden path outside the hospice wing. When she declined, he smiled and said, "Some things are best witnessed in the light." But Breck didn't need charm. She needed access. And she had it. She ordered a temporary hold on all after-hours death pronouncements and the sealing of the entire mortuary floor pending review. She asked for the cremation logs from the past 10 years, the linen burn schedules, the refrigeration maintenance reports, and the full staff registry for the prep wing. That afternoon, the bottle rack was quietly removed from Prep Room C. The hooks were left behind. Dean Harrow called the governor's office to report an aggressive and unjustified inspection. He used the word harassment in writing, claimed Breck's investigation was religiously biased, said she was disrupting sacred rituals. But Breck had already seen enough. In one drawer, she found a list, a folded page labeled Uncollected Heir, 11 initials, all marked with dates. The first and last dates were exactly 5 years apart. Each bore the same notation. Held for return. No release. She took it with her. That night in her hotel room, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the nurse who had walked past her in the hall without blinking, about the faint smell of ash in the quiet room, about the woman in records who, when asked about a recovery case, had said, "That wasn't a patient. That was a pause." And then she thought about the note. Ask about the quiet room. But no one ever really answered. They just redirected, smiled, poured tea. Something was coiling in that hospital. Not a scandal, not fraud, but a practice. Older than policy, older than medicine. Something dressed in calm voices and gentle hands. Something counting. And whatever it was, it didn't like to be interrupted. The notebook wasn't in the usual drawer, it was beneath the drawer, a thin false bottom beneath Dr. Lark's tidy pens, condolence stationery, and pressed flowers. Inspector Breck found it during the 3rd hour of her return visit, after instructing staff to vacate the office for fire code review. It was unmarked on the cover, bound in soft leather that had darkened with finger oils, the spine barely intact. Inside, the pages were handwritten in the same careful script she'd seen on hospital certificates, Dr. Walter Lark's. But this wasn't clinical language. This was philosophy, ritual, faith. He called it second waking. The first entry was dated nearly 12 years prior. It described the moment a patient opened her eyes 3 minutes after being declared and looked directly into his. There was no confusion in her gaze, he wrote, only clarity, as if something had been resolved. He claimed the body does not immediately relinquish the self. That breath, though ceased, is not the signal we believe it is. He argued that the first death is simply the settling of noise, and that the soul, if given silence and cold, may reach its true shape. He believed that in this state, between the ending and the erasure, a person could face what they were, and in very rare cases, return cleansed. He wrote of quiet protocols, of hollowing time, of breathless communion. He referenced the quiet room repeatedly, not as a space for pronouncement, but as a crucible, a testing ground. The silence was not for the staff. It was for them, for the nearly dead, for the ones whose souls hadn't been sealed. He kept meticulous track. 11 candidates. He noted each one's reversal moment, a gasp, a word, a tremor, followed by either reintegration or dismissal. Those who did not reintegrate were released from the cycle. There was no elaboration. The notebook never once used the word murder. It never mentioned fear. There was no malice in his handwriting, only order. Cold, deliberate control. He believed he was offering something vital, that second waking was not an error but a calling. Breck flipped further. In the margins were symbols, the same ones from the anonymous ledger pages, loops, crescents, hooked lines, each tied to a patient, each logged with a chime number. He wrote that when the glass sang, it meant the soul had spoken. He underlined this. If the bottle sings a third time, the body must be silenced. If not, it becomes echo. On the final page, dated 6 months ago, he wrote simply, 10 complete, 1 unclaimed. After reading it twice, Breck locked the book in her satchel and turned to search Sister Mercy's prep space. The drawers were nearly empty. Only one remained sealed, brass-handled, stamped with the Silver Creek crest. She forced it open. Inside were 5 neatly folded linen strips, unlike any in the standard inventory. Each bore a faint red mark stitched at the corner. Ixtan, 11. The fabric was soft, warm to the touch despite the cold metal drawer. Not warm from heat. Warm like skin left out of the cold too long. She took one in her hand. Beneath it was a list folded once, no names, just initials. 11, each followed by a looped symbol. None of it made a sound. But in that moment, Breck didn't need noise. The weight of silence told her more than any scream. She knew what the hospital would say, that it was spiritual care, that it was symbolic, that no law had been broken, no signatures forged, no lives taken in the eyes of statute. But she also knew what evil looked like. Not wild, not frenzied, but clean, ordered, justified in its own mind, the kind that whispers mercy while holding your mouth closed. She returned the list to the drawer, but she kept the linen, because the confession wasn't written in blood, it was stitched. The inquest took place under gray skies in the county courthouse 3 miles east of Silver Creek Hospital. It was led by Judge Evelyn Sloan, a woman known for her restraint, who listened more than she spoke and measured every decision by the silence that followed. The courtroom was cold that day, as if the chill from the mortuary floors had followed the witnesses in. Not many came forward. Most of the families who had lost someone in that hospital had already buried twice, once in grief, once in silence. But a few survivors did speak. Mabel Durant, her voice slow and eyes never quite meeting the judge's, described waking up during what she was told was a fever. But she remembered no hospital bed. Only the feeling of porcelain against her spine and the taste of something like candle wax in her mouth. David Klein, wrists trembling under the table, didn't remember how he'd gotten home from the hospital. But he remembered a sound, thin and high, like glass being touched by warm breath. He remembered staring at the ceiling and seeing faces that weren't faces, only shadows that smiled without moving. Others tried to speak but couldn't find words. They stuttered. They cried, not from pain but from confusion that had no place to settle. Breck submitted the ledger pages, the linen-stamped Einon, and the copy of Dr. Lark's notebook, which the hospital claimed as misinterpreted personal philosophy. The board chair, Dean Harrow, resigned 2 days before testimony began. Dr. Lark was declared medically unfit to appear. Sister Mercy Hale never surfaced. Her quarters had been emptied, her ledger missing. The state moved swiftly. Within 4 months, the Postmortem Integrity and Consent Act was signed into law. It required a 24-hour hold on all non-traumatic deaths, banned solitary pronouncements without recorded vitals, and enforced a triple-sign verification from medical staff, oversight, and next of kin. Private quiet rooms were prohibited. All post-mortem care required family presence unless legally waived. Hospitals were instructed to review all rituals, spiritual practices, or symbolic preparations and submit documentation for legal compliance. Silver Creek Hospital shut its mortuary wing indefinitely. The prep rooms were sealed. The bottle rack was never recovered. A year later, by quiet vote, the town council approved the building of a small memorial along the riverbank behind the hospital. 11 panes of glass, set upright in a half-moon arc, each marked only with a chime number. No names, no dates, just silence. Visitors say the wind sounds different there, that when it blows through the trees it hums faintly, like a breath caught in a bottle. The plaque reads, "To those who came back and were not believed." Years passed. The town changed, the mill shut down, new homes rose on old fields, and Silver Creek Hospital was quietly torn down one spring morning without ceremony or public notice. No preservation vote, no memorial plaque on site. The ground was leveled, and a dental office took its place. But the land never quite settled. Contractors spoke of foundations that cracked too soon, of wiring that hummed even before it was connected. Some said they heard a faint clinking when the wind blew through the stairwells, like bottles knocking gently together on unseen hooks. Down by the river, the memorial glass still stands. 11 panes, each narrow and tall, angled just slightly so that at certain times of day, they catch the sun in a way that casts long, soft shadows in a half-circle. People walk by without knowing. But on windy days, if you pause, the glass sings. Not loudly. Just enough. Thin notes, no melody, just breath turned to tone. It never lasts long. And it never repeats. Nora Pike, now in her 40s, keeps a locked drawer in her home. Inside it, she still has the copied ledger pages, the grease pencil rubbings, her childhood handwriting next to the looping mark she didn't understand back then. She never returned to healthcare, but she never really left it either. Sometimes, late at night, she takes the papers out and lays them on the floor in the order she first found them. The pattern still hums beneath the ink. One page bears a line she didn't see until years after the inquest. A margin note, written faintly in the corner of Dr. Lark's original notebook, the final line he ever wrote. Obedience continues after breath. She didn't know what it meant at first, but now she thinks she does, because evil didn't scream in that place. It didn't drag or stab or chase. It whispered. It comforted. It gave warm tea to the grieving and tucked linens beneath the chin. It smiled while closing eyelids. It sang soft notes no one questioned. It wrapped its fingers around the idea of helping. And when it wrote, it used cursive. When it touched, it used gloves. It was never about death. It was about what follows. What control looks like when no one stops to see what it's holding still. No names were ever engraved. No sentences were ever served. But the laws changed, and the silence for a time grew quieter. Still, on certain nights, at 3:16 a.m. the wind moves a certain way and people swear they hear a sound rising from the trees behind where the hospital once stood. It's not quite a bell, not quite breath, just enough to make you stop and wonder, what do you think? Could this happen again? Could this